Am I streaming? All right. That might have been a weird start. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of my live cast. I'm Stacy Budge Camison with UrbanGypZ, and today I'm going to talk about using your knitting stash for art weaving. Now, I know generally people are already kind of doing that. I think a lot of you guys might be knitters or crocheters that have started to do some art weaving using the small rigid heddle looms. And naturally you think, another way to use my stash. I know that's what I thought. Anyway, but I kind of wanted to go over using that stash for art weaving. A lot of if you ever go to places like Paradise Fibers, a lot of times if you look under their weaving yarns, what you're going to find is a lot of yarns that look kind of like this. Kind of thin, rayon-y, or it might be yarns made out of linen or cotton, but kind of thinnish yarns. And this is like really different from what you usually knit with. I think the only other thing you might use something similar to this to knit with is if you do like silk lace shawls or something like that. I have some other, this I think is a mill-end fiber, which is a little thicker, but not by much. I mean, this is not something you think of when you think of knitting with yarn. So today, so the difference is you have this thin yarn, and usually I'm going to show you, like, your knitting yarn. This is just a regular old worsted weight yarn, and you can art weave with this. And you can do like traditional kind of weaving with this, but there's some considerations that you need to think of. So today I kind of wanted to go through, when you're going through your stash and thinking about it in terms of art weaving, I want to give you some things, some guidelines maybe to put in your head as you're assessing your yarn, thinking of different ways that you might weave with it when you're doing art weaving. And by art weaving, if you're new to my channel, I mean that kind of wild weaving, and I'll put a link down below so you can reference that if you're new. But most of you guys, I'm thinking you're familiar with what I mean by art weaving, and it's a kind of a freeform type of knitting weaving, a freeform kind of weaving that focuses on texture and color and just kind of inspirations within the moment. So anyway, I wanted to give a shout out and a hey to everybody joining today. Hi, Sarah and Jackrabbit London. I can't remember what your real name is. And Connie Muse. Hi everybody. Okay. So I think when it comes to using your yarn, the best yarn I like to use for my warp. Now, and granted, okay, so this weaving yarn, what makes it really good for warp is that it's really, really strong. I mean, because when you're warping, even just on a little rigid heddle loom, you're really having to get some tension, and so you're putting some stress on the yarn. So that's, I think, sock yarn. Sock yarn is really, really good for that, and in particular, plied yarns. Plied sock yarns are great for warp, especially if it has some kind of nylon or silk or some kind of fiber that gives it a little strength. And sock yarns in general are really good for because they have to be sturdy because they're being used for socks. So that's a really good solution for warp. And also your it's kind of a little thinner. So when you're warping with sock yarn, you're giving more room for to show off your fancy, maybe your hand spun yarns or your novelty yarns in the weft. And generally art yarn weaving for the most part, has to do with weaving in the moment with the weft. All right, let me put these away. All right. Kinds of sock yarn that's not good for warp would be things like your single ply sock yarns, things like Noro sock. I think even though it has a bit of nylon in it, because it's a single ply, it's not as sturdy as like a plied sock yarn. And the same holds true for just any other kind of single ply. I have a merino single ply that I use that's just not sturdy. So I would stay away from those and just use those in the weft if you're going to use those for weaving. Now you can use worsted weight yarns, but those are, especially if you're using like a smaller loom, a lot of times the worsted weight yarns are a little too thick. I mean, it's gonna, for using with a warp, I mean, it's gonna kind of overpower your weaving a little bit. And so I would kind of stay away from these with a warp if you're doing anything 15 inches or smaller. If you're going bigger, you know, this is going to seem smaller, relatively speaking, to your piece. So I maybe would go with that for something a little wider. But if you're wanting to give focus to what you're using with the weft to actually weave, then I would go with something thinner, like a sock yarn. And that being said, hand spun yarns, I kind of tend, if it's, again, same principle, if it's anything smaller than 15 inch, I'll only use the hand spun, maybe 1 or 2 warp threads, just to give interest, and it gives almost like a corded effect. So, you know, it kind of stands out as a vertical bump. The novelty yarns, things like your fun fur, generally speaking, I use these in very limited amounts. They're really fun to put as far as like one strand for the warp, but if you use it completely for the warp, it's gonna overpower your weaving. And actually, same goes true for the weft. I only use fun fur or anything like super novelty like this in small doses, because otherwise it's going to start to, I mean, it's the same with knitting with this kind of yarn. It starts to look like a Muppet pelt. I mean, it's just like big fur. So I just use maybe this sparingly, just to add a little bit of accent. And the same would hold true for any like wild hand spun yarns with stuff like this. I've seen pieces where people have used this like completely, and those have been pretty interesting, but there's a lot more interest going on in something like this than something like this. I mean, this is all the same fluff, whereas this, every inch is different, you know, and to the degree of lots of fluff to just a little bit of texture to a sequin, just, you know, stuff like that. So I would kind of take that all into consideration. Now this is really good, again, if you want to do one strand of warp with something like this. That would be interesting. And I've seen where people have taken this and done, and you know, if you get those heddles that are like the 2.5 DPI and just do, you know, art yarn, crazy art yarn and some ribbon, and throw those in. Now, those can be pretty interesting as far as warps go. But if you do that, I would tend to think that you would want to stick with something really simple as far as your weft goes. And as a matter of fact, I've done a couple of pieces, and I'll put a link in the show notes. During Vlogmas, I did a scarf with a crazy art yarn warp, but the weft I used a really thin lace yarn, and that mainly was to kind of tack the art yarns together, because you really want to show off the art yarn. As far as if you're doing an art yarn warp, you want that to show off. So the weft really is only serving the purposes to just kind of loosely hold those pieces together. Now I might do sections where it's a weft face, which means that I would bunch all those picks together to where it would completely cover up sections of, just small sections of the art yarn warp, and just in little areas. But anyway, I'll put a link in the show notes to those videos in Vlogmas that show you how I made the scarf out of the art yarn warp. So I've found too, when I've been spinning yarns, I've been spinning yarns specifically for weaving, I find myself going pretty thin. And that's because it seems like, especially if I'm using, the sock yarn as far as a warp goes, that I just like the look of a thinner hand spun a little better. I mean, I don't mind an occasional, 2-ply, a little section of that, but I think using a lot of a worsted weight yarn for a weft in your weaving kind of makes the fabric really, really stiff. So I've been kind of going a little thin. Now this yarn, this hand spun that I've done, it's technically an art yarn, but if you look back here, it just looks like a messy single. But if you're looking at, I don't know if you can see, if you're looking at the details of this, let's see if you can see that. I'm trying to get it to focus. There we go. There's little bits of detail. There's a little, lots of little fibers going on. There's a little bit of Angelina in there. There's a lot going on individually in the yarn. So I've been spinning a lot of stuff like this. I'll do some art bats and card them just a little finer and add the details. Now I have done some where I do have locks in there, and so it'll be this thin with just a little bit of lock in there, and that's really interesting as far as, because when you're weaving you still have, it makes those stand out more because there's more of a contrast between the thinness of the single and then a wild piece of lock. I guess this is a little thicker than this one. Yeah, this is, I'm still spinning it pretty thin here. So the other thing I wanted to mention, and I didn't bring a sample of the yarn. They have yarns that they sell that are like threads with like sequins or beads or even little tufts of fluff. That's kind of like this. If it's really thin and it's like a yarn that you normally would carry through with knitting, I would treat that the same as far as your weaving. I would not put those, I mean, I guess you could put those by themselves with the weaving. I mean, so long as your warp was sturdy enough to not make that little area so fragile. But otherwise I would take those threads with the little bits of sequins and beads and whatever, and I would carry it with your other yarn and use it as little bits of accent. So and that's it. I mean, I guess I would I know a lot of people have a lot of sock yarn stash, and that's what I primarily use for my weaving, even just for the weft. And I think it's mainly because the weft and if the warp is the sock yarn and the weft is a sock yarn, that produces a more balanced weave and not as stiff of a fabric. So just kind of generally as a rule of thumb, when you're looking to figure out which size heddle reed to use on your rigid heddle loom, kind of a general rule of thumb is I start with a 7.5 DPI for the sock yarn. That I feel like gives a nice drapey-ish, not too dense weave, and then you can just adjust it from there. I mean, it's kind of the same as when you're knitting. If you're starting out with a number 3 needle, when you're knitting socks, and then you just gauge it from there. If you were doing a shawl, you might use a bigger needle. So if you were doing a shawl and you want something a little more drapey, then you can always adjust that DPI with whatever you have. The only difference would be, I think, if I'm using, the wild art yarn, I go as big as I can go, because and usually for me that's a 2.5. I don't think I've even seen anything outside of that, other than like on a loom. I think I've seen people rig something up and then just not use a heddle. They just kind of beat it with a comb, or find a way to beat it into place. So yeah, that's generally, if you're looking at your yarn stash and you're trying to decide what you're going to use, I would tend to put the worsted weight aside and save that for your knitting, and go with sock yarn and your hand spun and any novelty yarns. So there you have it. All right, it's going to be a kind of short one today. So does anybody have any questions for me? Anyway, I'm going to read through the comments. Hey Stacy. Hi Sarah. Hi Jackrabbit London. Hi Connie. Hi Lynn. You were my thank you from Lynn from the UK. Hi. Oh, I'm glad. Thank you, Lynn. I'm glad that you found your groove. Terry. Hi. And Epiphany London. Hi. Thanks for joining me. So are there any questions? Anybody about art weaving or anything? I'll give it a minute. I'll also put down in the link below, if you're not already a part of the Fiber Art Collective, that has been just a really super, super inspirational place to share ideas. It's just wonderful. I get inspired so much by what you guys post, and that just everybody, there's all different levels. There's people can ask questions, and if you ask a question, there's always a million answers. People have a lot of answers for you, so everybody's very supportive. All right, Carrie wants to know, where's a good place to get ribbon yarn? That's a good question. A good place to get ribbon yarn, I like, I get Sari silk yarn ribbon, and I used to order that because I used to distribute Sari ribbon. I don't sell yarn anymore, but Darn Good Yarn, she has a really good selection of that kind of ribbon. That might be a little thicker than what you want, but it's really good. I like it for art weaving. I don't do a ton, big section of it. I might lay a piece or two down, and that's my favorite place. Otherwise, this is gonna sound crazy, but at Michael's and AC Moore and Joann's, those kind of craft stores, there's actually a kind of cheapish brand of ribbon that's crazy sparkly and pretty. I mean, yeah, so you might check there. Otherwise, Dharma Trading is a place that I get all my dye supplies from. I want to say, and I could be wrong, it's been a while, but they used to sell little things of silk ribbon that's dyeable. They're like little spools, and so I guess you could unwind it into a skein and dye it like you would a skein of yarn, but that would be a really great place, and again, I'll put that in the show notes as well. Anyway, do you still knit, or has weaving totally seduced you? Weaving has almost totally seduced me. Now, I did make a promise that I was going to finish 2 sweaters by the end of the year. And I really don't have that lot farther to go on those. And I really, really want some new clothes by the time it gets cold. So we'll see. Maybe that'll inspire me to actually sit down and do some knitting during the Alabama game this Saturday. Anyway, yeah. I really don't knit as much as I used to, which is a shame because I really like sweaters. So anyway, thanks for your question. Darn Good Yarn is local where I live. Oh, I'm so jealous. I love her stuff. Her stuff is really cool. She really has sourced some great materials. As a matter of fact, I went to a Sari studio local to here, and she gets a lot of her stuff from Darn Good Yarn. It's really cool. What is the Fiber Collective? Okay, Susan, the Fiber Collective is a private Facebook group that I have, and it's I'll put a link. Actually, I think the link to sign up might be in the description. If not, I'll put it in the description. And it's a private Facebook group of about 1,700 fiber artists that are encouraging and sharing work. So join us. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on there. All right. Thank you. I want to add it to an art yarn warp. Yes. Oh yes. The ribbon would be beautiful in an art. You know what's really cool in an art yarn warp too is if you go to if you look in the fabric stores and near like the upholstery section, things like pom-pom fringe and stuff like that. That's some really cool stuff to put in for an art yarn warp. And we have a thrift store here that has stuff like that. So yeah, that'd be pretty wild. Yeah. All right. Are there any other questions? I'm going to give it a minute. Yeah, I think weaving's totally seduced me, especially since I have the new loom. I've been really playing with that. And but I like my little loom. I keep going back to that little loom because it's so easy to move around. I mean, if I'm working on a bigger loom, I'm kind of committing to like hang out in that room all day, where I might want to, be upstairs and hang out with my husband while we watch, a movie or something. So anyway, yeah. But, see, there it is. Knitting's more portable, so maybe I should be doing that. Maybe I should put my knitting projects upstairs so I can be seduced to doing my knitting if I want to spend time with my husband. Right? All right. I think I'm going to sign off for now. Thanks for joining me. It's going to be a short one today, and I'll put show notes in that blog post, and then link the blog post in the description of this video. So here's another question from Cynthia. Do you ever use a variable dent reed on your loom? I want a variable dent reed so bad. I can't stand it, and I've always found other things to spend my money on. But yeah, those are good. Those are nice. Those are really nice. But if without having a variable dent, to kind of fake a variable dent, excuse me, I would probably take like the biggest dent that I have for like my little loom. Let's say I'm just doing it on my little loom, and I have a 2.5 reed. So where I have the thinner yarns, I would just put like more than one yarn through the hole or the slot, and do it that way. Well, but then I would still have to do, if I was weaving, I would still have to weave it in and out instead of doing the up and down. Yeah, I really want a variable dent reed. Yeah, those are awesome. All right. Now I'm really signing off. So anyway, thanks for joining. I'll put resources that I mentioned here in the show notes on the blog post, and link that blog post in the description down below. Anyway, thanks for joining, and I will see you guys next week. Bye.